Most free Americans benefited from economic growth, but as colonial society matured, an elite emerged that, while neither as powerful nor as wealthy as the aristocracy of England, increasingly dominated politics and society. Indeed, the gap between rich and poor probably grew more rapidly in the 18th century than in any other period of American history. In New England and the Middle Colonies, expanding trade made possible the emergence of a powerful upper class of merchants, often linked by family or commercial ties to great trading firms in London. There were no banks in colonial America. Credit and money were in short supply, and mercantile success depended on personal connections as much as business talent. By 1750, the Chesapeake and Lower South were dominated by slave plantations producing staple crops, especially tobacco and rice, for the world market. Here, great planters accumulated enormous wealth. The colonial elite also included the rulers of proprietary colonies like Pennsylvania and Maryland. America had no titled aristocracy as in Britain. It had no system of legally established social ranks or family pedigrees stretching back to medieval times. Apart from the Delanceys, Livingstons, and Van Rensselaers of New York, the Penn family in Pennsylvania, and a few Southern planters, it had no one whose land holdings in monetary value rivaled those of the British aristocracy. But throughout British America, men of prominence controlled colonial government. In Virginia, the upper class was so tight-knit and intermarried so often that the colony was said to be governed by a cousinocracy. Members of the gentry controlled the vestries or local governing bodies of the established Anglican Church, dominated the county courts, political as well as judicial institutions that levied taxes and enacted local ordinances, and were prominent in Virginia's legislature. In the 1750s, 7 members of the same generation of the Lee family sat in the House of Burgesses. 18th century Virginia was a far healthier environment than in the early days of settlement. Planters could expect to pass their wealth down to the next generation, providing estates for their sons and establishing family dynasties. Nearly every Virginian of note achieved prominence through family connections. The days when self-made men could rise into the Virginia gentry were long gone. By 1770, nearly all upper-class Virginians had inherited their wealth. Thomas Jefferson's grandfather was a justice of the peace, an important local official, militia captain and sheriff, and his father a member of the House of Burgesses. George Washington's father, grandfather, and great-grandfather had been justices of the peace. The Virginia gentry used its control of provincial government to gain possession of large tracts of land as western areas opened for settlement. Grants of 20,000 to 40,000 acres were not uncommon. Robert King Carter, a Speaker of the House of Burgesses, acquired 300,000 acres of land and 1,000 slaves by the time of his death in 1732. Before the American Revolution, there was no real American identity. In the 17th century, the term Americans tended to be used to describe Indians rather than colonists. Europeans often depicted the colonies pictorially with an image of a Native American. Many European immigrants maintained traditions, including the use of languages other than English from their home countries. Some cultures mixed more than others. Intermarriage with other groups was more common among Huguenots or French Protestants than among Jews, for example. Those from the British Isles sought to create a dominant English identity in the New World. This involved convincing Britons that the colonists were like themselves. Many in Great Britain, however, saw the colonists as a collection of convicts, religious dissidents, and impoverished servants. This, in turn, inspired many colonists to assert a claim to Britishness more strongly. They insisted that British identity meant allegiance to certain values, among them free commerce and English liberty. Yet many colonists saw some people, including American Indians and Africans, as unable to wield the responsibilities of liberty due to their place of birth, culture, or inborn traits. They must be ruled over, not take part in governance. British identity in the colonies was defined in part in opposition to others, including Spanish and French Catholics, Africans, and Native Americans. As early as the late 16th century, in his writings on colonization, Richard Hakluyt wrote that there was no greater glory than to conquer the barbarian, to recall the savage and the pagan to civility, to draw the ignorant within the orbit of reason, and to fill with reverence for divinity the godless and the ungodly. But since most Indians preferred to maintain their own cultures and religions, the colonists did not include them in a collective colonial identity. This was a major difference with the Spanish and French New World empires, where, as noted in Chapter 1, intermarriage and culture exchange between settlers and Indians was far more common. For much of the 18th century, the American colonies had more regular trade and communications with Britain than among themselves. Elites in different regions slowly developed a common lifestyle and sense of common interests. But rather than thinking of themselves as distinctively American, they became more and more English, a process historians call Anglicization. Wealthy Americans tried to model their lives on British etiquette and behavior. Somewhat resentful at living in provincial isolation, at the end of the world, as one Virginia aristocrat put it, they sought to demonstrate their status and legitimacy by importing the latest London fashions and literature, sending their sons to Britain for education, and building homes equipped with fashionable furnishings modeled on the country estates and townhouses of the English gentry. Their residences included large rooms for entertainment display cases for imported luxury goods and elaborate formal gardens. Some members of the colonial elite, like George Washington, even had coats of arms designed for their families in imitation of English upper-class practice. Desperate to follow an aristocratic lifestyle, many planters fell into debt. William Byrd III of Virginia lived so extravagantly that by 1770 he had accumulated a debt of £100,000, an amount almost unheard of in England or America. But so long as the world market for tobacco thrived, so did Virginia's gentry. The richest group of mainland colonists were South Carolina planters, although planters in Jamaica far outstripped them in wealth. The elite South Carolinians often traveled north to enjoy summer vacations in the cooler climate of Newport, Rhode Island. They spent much of the remainder of their time in Charleston, the only real urban center south of Philadelphia and the richest city in British North America. Here, aristocratic social life flourished, centered on theaters, literary societies, and social events. Like their Virginia counterparts, South Carolina grandees lived a lavish lifestyle amid imported furniture, fine wines, silk clothing, and other items from England. They surrounded themselves with house slaves dressed in specially designed uniforms. In 1774, the per capita wealth in the Charleston district was £2,300, more than 4 times that of tobacco areas in Virginia, and 8 times the figure for Philadelphia or Boston. But wealth in South Carolina was highly concentrated. The richest 10% of the colony owned half the wealth in 1770, the poorest quarter less than 2%. Throughout the colonies, elites emulated what they saw as England's balanced, stable social order. Liberty in their eyes meant in part the power to rule, the right of those blessed with wealth and prominence to dominate over others. They viewed society as a hierarchical structure in which some men were endowed with greater talents than others and destined to rule. The social order, they believed, was held together by webs of influence that linked patrons and those dependent on them. Each place in the hierarchy carried with it different responsibilities, and one's status was revealed in dress, manners, and the splendor of one's home. Superiority and dependence, as one colonial newspaper put it, were natural elements of any society. An image of refinement served to legitimize wealth and political power. Colonial elites prided themselves on developing aristocratic manners, cultivating the arts, and making productive use of leisure. Indeed, on both sides of the Atlantic, elites viewed work as something reserved for common folk and slaves. Freedom from labor was the mark of the gentleman. At the other end of the social scale, poverty emerged as a visible feature of 18th-century colonial life. Although not considered by most colonists part of their society, the growing number of slaves lived in impoverished conditions. Among free Americans, poverty was hardly as widespread as in Britain, where in the early part of the century between 1/4 and 1/2 of the people regularly required public assistance. But as the colonial population expanded, access to land diminished rapidly, especially in long-settled areas. In New England, which received few immigrants, the high birth rate fueled population growth. With the supply of land limited, sons who could not hope to inherit farms were forced to move to other colonies or to try their hand at a trade in the region's towns. By mid-century, tenants and wage laborers were a growing presence on farms in the middle colonies. In colonial cities, the number of propertyless wage earners subsisting at the poverty line steadily increased. Taking the colonies as a whole, half of the wealth at mid-century was concentrated in the hands of the richest 10% of the population. Attitudes and policies toward poverty in colonial America mirrored British precedents. The better-off colonists generally viewed the poor as lazy, shiftless, and responsible for their own plight. Both rural communities and cities did accept responsibility for assisting their own, but to minimize the burden on taxpayers, poor persons were frequently set to labor in workhouses, where they produced goods that reimbursed authorities for part of their upkeep. Their children were sent to work as apprentices in local homes or workshops, and most communities adopted stringent measures to warn out unemployed and propertyless newcomers who might become dependent on local poor relief. This involved town authorities either expelling the unwanted poor from an area or formally declaring certain persons ineligible for assistance. In Essex County, Massachusetts, the number of poor persons warned out each year rose from 200 in the 1730s to 1,700 in the 1760s. Many were members of families headed by widowed or abandoned women. The large majority of free Americans lived between the extremes of wealth and poverty. Along with racial and ethnic diversity, what distinguished the mainland colonies from Europe was the wide distribution of land and the economic autonomy of most ordinary free families. The anonymous author of the book American Husbandry, published in 1775, reported that little freeholders who live upon their own property made up the most considerable part of the people, especially in the northern colonies and the non-plantation parts of the South. Altogether, perhaps 2/3 of the free male population were farmers who owned their own land. England, to be sure, had no class of laborers as exploited as American slaves, but 3/5 of its people owned no property at all. By the 18th century, colonial farm families viewed land ownership almost as a right, the social precondition of freedom. They strongly resented efforts, whether by Native Americans, great landlords, or colonial governments, to limit their access to land. A dislike of personal dependence and an understanding of freedom as not relying on others for a livelihood sank deep roots in British North America. These beliefs, after all, accorded with social reality, a wide distribution of property that made economic independence part of the lived experience of large numbers of white colonists. In the household economy of 18th century America, the family was the center of economic life. Most work revolved around the home, and all members, men, women, and children, contributed to the family's livelihood. The independence of the small farmer depended in considerable measure on the labor of dependent women and children. "He that hath an industrious family shall soon be rich," declared one colonial saying, and the high birth rate in part reflected the need for as many hands as possible on colonial farms. Most farmers concentrated first on growing food for their own consumption and acquiring enough land to pass it along to their sons. But the consumer revolution and expanding networks of Atlantic trade drew increasing numbers of farmers into production for the market as well. As the population grew and the death rate declined, family life stabilized, and more marriages became lifetime commitments. Free women were expected to devote their lives to being good wives and mothers. Already enshrined in law and property relations, male domination took on greater and greater social reality. In several colonies, the law mandated primogeniture, meaning that estates must be passed intact to the oldest son. As colonial society became more structured, opportunities that had existed for women in the early period receded. In Connecticut, for example, the courts were informal and unorganized in the 17th century, and women often represented themselves. In the 18th century, it became necessary to hire a lawyer as one's spokesman in court. Women, barred from practicing as attorneys, disappeared from judicial proceedings. Because of the desperate need for labor, men and women in the 17th century both did various kinds of work. In the 18th century, the division of labor along gender lines solidified. Women's work was clearly defined, including cooking, cleaning, sewing, making butter, and assisting with agricultural chores. The work of farmers' wives and daughters often spelled the difference between a family's self-sufficiency and poverty. Women's work is never done. This popular adage was literally true. Even as the consumer revolution reduced the demands on many women by making available store-bought goods previously produced at home, women's work seemed to increase. Lower infant mortality meant more time spent on childcare and domestic chores. The demand for new goods increased the need for all family members to contribute to family income. For most women, work was incessant and exhausting. "I am dirty and distressed, almost wearied to death," wrote Mary Cooper, a Long Island woman, in her diary in 1769. "This day," she continued, "is 40 years since I left my father's house and come here, and here have I seen little else but hard labor and sorrow." By the mid-18th century, the area that would become the United States was home to a remarkable diversity of peoples and different kinds of social organization, from Pueblo villages of the Southwest to tobacco plantations of the Chesapeake, towns and small farms of New England, land holdings in the Hudson Valley that resembled feudal estates, and fur trading outposts of the northern and western frontier. Elites tied to imperial centers of power dominated the political and economic life of nearly every colony. But large numbers of colonists enjoyed far greater opportunities for freedom: access to the vote, prospects of acquiring land, the right to worship as they pleased, and an escape from oppressive government than existed in Europe. Free colonists probably enjoyed the highest per capita income in the world. The colony's economic growth contributed to a high birth rate, long life expectancy, and expanding demand for consumer goods. In the British colonies, writes one historian, lived thousands of the freest individuals the Western world has ever known. Yet many others found themselves confined to the partial freedom of indentured servitude or to the complete absence of freedom in slavery. Both timeless longings for freedom and new and unprecedented forms of unfreedom had been essential to the North American colony's remarkable development.